for most of Warhammer 40k's history, you have to remember the deal of the setting is that it's 5 minutes to midnight. At some point, Abaddon the Despoiler is going to get his stuff together. He's going to conduct this 13th Black Crusade, and that will bring the Imperium to its knees. That will be the last days of humanity, the triumph of ruin. However, some years ago, Games Workshop, they got a new CEO. They decided they wanted to make more money, and they came to the conclusion that we can actually just push this storyline forward. And so they actually had Abaddon conduct this 13th Black Crusade. The Indomitus period is what we call kind of new 40k, as it were. Games Workshop released a list of 27 books in the Silent King novel that they say make up the Indomitus timeline. The timeline since the fall of Cadia, the opening of the Great Rift, and the return of Rabute Guilliman. And the nice thing about this timeline is that these books basically take you from the return of Rabute Guilliman to the return of Lion L. Johnson. Now, when I read this list, the nice thing about it is that A, a lot of these books are very good, and B, I've actually read all of these, so I thought today it might be really fun if I take you through this list and explain to you the main plots going on in the setting right now, and which ones you should read, because a lot of them are very important and have plot points that will definitely play a big role in 40k's future. Thankfully, you're going to be very excited, 40k fans, because a lot of these books are written by Chris Raitt, which is good, not just because he's a fantastic author, but because he has one of those jobs where he defines a lot within the setting. So for example, in this book, The Carrion Throne, this book is the book to read, my brothers and sisters, if you want to know what's it like to live on Terra in the 41st millennium. If you're relatively new to Warhammer, you're probably used to these big golden dudes being all over the place, but it's important to remember that when we look at the Custodians, for most of 40k's history, they're sort of a faction that doesn't really exist. They're a faction that used to exist in the Horus Heresy, but for 10,000 years, they've donned black, they've been mourning, and they've just been, mostly as far as we know, sitting inside the Imperial Palace, not really doing much. It's rumoured that they've been striding out into the galaxy in secret, but for most of the time, people didn't even think they were real. They thought they were like a myth. And it even gets to the point that in the book Carrion Throne, when the Inquisition see Custodians, they're genuinely surprised, because even to an Inquisitor who's a very high-ranking person in the Imperial hierarchy, it's like, oh my god, Custodians are real? I had no idea Custodians were real. This book is truly fantastic and definitely a must-read on this list. So in this story, we're introduced to Erasmus Crowell, and he is an Inquisitor who is trying to uncover a mystery on Terra. There's a series of deaths going on, and there's a plot seemingly connected to someone called the False Angel. And this book starts us off with a major 40k plotline, as he uncovers that there's been a plot conducted by other members of the Inquisition, and we'll later find out members of the High Lords of Terra, who have been, for some reason, working with the Drukhari, a Xenos race that, as far as we know, are entirely hostile to humanity. But they actually brought a Drukhari homunculus, who's like a twisted, evil doctor of the Drukhari, to Terra, and he escaped. He was living in these catacombs on Terra and was turning people into monsters and unleashing them on the general public. And so he starts to unravel this mystery, and he comes to the conclusion, of course, that he needs to go deeper. Even though he does manage to kill this homunculus, he knows he needs to push further. He knows he needs to discover what's going on. This will come up later, ladies and gentlemen. I can tell you that for sure. So we start off the Indomitus period with the discovery that there's a massive conspiracy going on Terra. And then in this book, The Carrion Throne, we actually discover something terrible. We discover that the world of Cadia has fallen. Cadia is a very important planet in 40k, or at least it was. Because the next book, The Fall of Cadia, covers this in depth, where we see Abaddon the Despoiler conduct his 13th Black Crusade. Abaddon is the successor of Horus Lupercal. He is the War Master of Chaos. He is the big bad in Warhammer. And in this book, he actually finally destroys Cadia, and he ultimately does this as famously he kind of can't defeat the Cadians on the planet and the forces that have come to support them. You've got Space Wolves, you've got Dark Angels, you've got Sisters of Battle. There's even a Custodian that rocks up once Trajan the Infinite throws him into the fray. It's a whole mess. Abaddon doesn't come out on top on the battlefield, so he throws a Blackstone fortress, which is piloted by his adopted daughter, into the planet. And that ends up destroying the world of Cadia. This is a massive deal, ladies and gentlemen, for Warhammer 40k, because it turns out that Cadia is not just important as a world of humanity and a world that's incredibly well fortified. It's important because Cadia had all of these Necron pylons on it. These mysterious black pylons. And it turns out that this planet was part of a chain of planets. And Abaddon somehow discovered this ancient technology, and he realized that if he destroyed certain planets throughout the Imperium and then destroyed Cadia, he would unleash something known as the Cicatrix Maledictum upon the Imperium. By destroying Cadia, what this meant was that the forces that hold the warp back from our galaxy would be weakened, and the Eye of Terror, which is where the warp and reality sort of overlap one another, would spill out into the Imperium. So now, if you ever look at a map of Warhammer 40k, you will no doubt see this in prominence, the Cicatrix Maledictum. Games Workshop actually released sort of a real image of what it looks like. This is the Milky Way galaxy, and it's got a scar down the middle. These are warp storms that have cut one half of the galaxy off from the other. So you have Imperium Sanctus, as we normally refer to it, and we have Imperium Nihilus. Imperium Nihilus are cut off from the rest of the Imperium. And the reason that's so important is because in Warhammer 40k, the reason you can travel faster than light is because you can jump into the warp and back out of it. You can still do that. However, you need to be able to see the light of the Emperor, the Astronomicon, which is a very powerful beacon that the Emperor projects into the warp, which acts as sort of like a North Star. And so, because in Imperium Nihilus, you can no longer see the light of the Master of Mankind, they can no longer travel easily across the Great Rift, and so travel on that side is very difficult, and they're not able to send messages back to Terra or communicate with forces, call for backup, etc, etc. So it has been a disastrous. The Cicatrix Maledictum is the greatest loss for the Imperium pretty much to date. It is Abaddon's great victory. Fall of Cadia itself is a great book. I would definitely recommend it. Robert Rath hasn't written too many 40k novels, but they've all been fantastic. If you're someone that's relatively new to 40k, you might well have read The Infinite and the Divine, which was also written by him. He's very good at writing Necrons. Trajan also appears in The Fall of Cadia. He's very funny. And in this story, he starts working with Belisarius Cawl, who's a very important character that we'll discover later. And he gives some information to Belisarius Cawl that is ultimately crucial to saving the Imperium. But the Fall of Cadia is certainly a great victory for Chaos. And with that, Abaddon and the forces of Chaos and the Xenos forces are basically free just to try and carve up as much of Imperium Nihilus as they want, and this has been devastating. We don't know exactly how many lives have been lost, but it is likely hundreds of millions of people have died because of this act, and so it's people don't like to give Abaddon his dues, but this was a pretty big win. I will just mention as well, because in this list of Indomitus books that Games Workshop released, they didn't include all recent novels. They didn't even include all recent novels that could fit into this timeline. And I will say Ashes of Cadia does give you a nice kind of follow-on from Fall of Cadia if you would like to read that, because Ursarkar Creed, the key general, he is actually lost when Cadia is lost. It is said that he has been captured by Trajan the Infinite, but the Imperium doesn't know this. However, his daughter ultimately discovers plans for like a secret Cadian weapon in Ashes of Cadia. The Cadians have got a list of backup worlds that they can now go to, which is pretty cool because even though Cadia is lost and everyone likes to say Cadia stands, Cadia is going to have another world in the future that they can kind of operate from. But the Cadians are a very important regiment in Warhammer 40k because they are one of the most populous regiments. Cadia for 10,000 years was just outside the Eye of Terror, and so for 10,000 years they pretty much did nothing but live and fight the forces of chaos. So they're still going, and the fall of Cadia led to the very famous saying, Cadia stands, because, as I say, Abaddon did have to chuck a Blackstone fortress at the planet. He couldn't beat the forces on the ground. Belisarius Cawl, working with the Imperial Saint Celestine, working with the Space Wolves, working with everybody, did manage to create a defense against Blackstone Fortress. So ultimately Abaddon had to just chuck the whole thing at the planet, which lost it. It's a really interesting book. One of the things I like about this book is that it does explain in detail why Abaddon couldn't just obliterate the planet from orbit, because you have to remember, he can do that. He has a ship called Planet Killer. However, he can't do this because not only does Abaddon need to destroy Cadia, he needs to destroy Cadia himself. As in, he can't use things that are perceived to be gifts to him from the Chaos Gods to destroy Cadia. And the ship, Planet Killer, even though he maintains he took it for himself, many within the Imperium and within the Forces of Chaos think it's just like a gift to him from the Chaos Gods. So he wanted to ensure that when Cadia fell, it was his victory, which was pretty cool. Following the fall of Cadia, we go on to the second Vaults of Terror book, The Hollow Mountain. So we've just spoken about the Astronomicon. In this book, Erasmus Crowell, this Inquisitor, he discovers that there are 3 High Lords of Terror that are connected to this conspiracy. This book is probably the one that is least interesting of the 3, but the Master of the Astronomicon is discovered to be part of this plot, and he tries to kill the Inquisitor and is ultimately killed himself. This leaves 2 other High Lords of Terror for Erasmus Crowell to go after, so we will see him return in one final novel. Ultimately, you're sort of seeing immediately a problem with the Imperium of Man. You have Inquisitors, you have High Lords of Terror who are acting independently of their allies. They're not working with anybody, and it's a real problem in traditional 40k that the High Lords of Terror are riven with corruption, bureaucracy, and it's something that has to be fixed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, takes us to the return of Roboute Guilliman. So Roboute Guilliman is a son of the Emperor of Mankind, and for 10,000 years he was lost. He was stuck in stasis because he had been brought low by his brother Fulgrim. We actually see him return to Terra in the next book we're going to look at, The Emperor's Legion by Chris Raitt. And in this book, we're introduced to a custodian called Valerian. He develops a relationship with a sister of battle known as Alea. In this book, Roboute Guilliman actually returns to Terra, and he is reforming the Imperium of Man. It's always been a problem that the High Lords of Terra have basically been holding the Imperium back because they are riven with corruption and bureaucracy, and so he's reforming the Imperial government. And this is very classic of him, because this is basically what he did 10,000 years earlier when the Emperor fell. However, now he is even going to start replacing High Lords of Terra, which will come up later. The Emperor's Legion is a really cool book because you get to see, for the first time, pretty much, details of what the Custodians are like in 40k. They do appear as a faction in the Horus Heresy series, but we didn't really know a lot about them. And in this book, for example, we discover Valerian, we discover him conducting something called a blood game, we discover him basically trying to become one of the highest ranking Custodians, one of the companions, someone who guards the Emperor, and he fails this test at the start of the book because when he kind of catches a glimpse of the Emperor, he freezes. And you can't do that because, of course, the Emperor needs the utmost protection. However, we also discover that he seems to have dreams. And that's a big deal in 40k because Custodians haven't dreamed for a long time. Some of them used to in 30k, but they don't typically dream. And so the ones that can dream are very important because they're basically treated as prophecies. They're sort of treated as messages from the Emperor, and to the degree that in the past, when Custodians could dream, their dreams were written down, and their dreams would be studied as to what their meanings could be in the future. As the story goes on, Valerian and Alea are on Terra when the Great Rift opens, the Cicatrix Maledictum, and with this, Cornate demons spill onto Terra, and we basically get a second Siege of Terra here, where the Custodians, who have now sort of risen up for the first time, and the returned Rebute Guilliman, lead their forces in defeating these Khorne demons to keep the citizens of Terra safe, and that is kind of the main conflict that exists at the end of the book. Did you mean to say Sisters of Silence, O Great Lord of Az? I did. Did I say Sisters of Battle? Sorry. Yes. Genuine question. Has Guilliman actually stepped foot on Terra since he was cast into the warp as a baby with all his bros? Yes, he actually is the Lord Commander of the Imperium when he returns. He doesn't really want to be on Terra all the time because he's an incredible warrior, an incredible commander, and so he wants to kind of go out and fight, and so he has to sort of deal with the idea that people want him to stay on Terra to command everything, but he really wants to go and take the fight to the enemy, take the fight to his brothers, who are also trying to kill him. Salmon, how about you shout a number for each book? 1 to 10, 10 critical to read at each of these. That's a good shout. Okay, let's do it. So the Carrion Throne, I would say, is a 10. Fall of Cadia, I would say, is a 9. I'll knock it down a point because I don't want to give everyone 10s, but also because Fall of Cadia also has a campaign book. The campaign book and the novel do cover different things, but you don't have to read the book, I wouldn't say. You wouldn't be missing out on key story. The Hollow Mountain, I want to give that a 7. I don't know why. It's just the least interesting of the 3, but it's still Chris Wright, so it's pretty good. And then The Emperor's Legion, I'd give another 10. Another 10, another Chris Wright book, The Lords of Silence. So with the Great Rift opening, it has actually been said by Rebute Guilliman that all of his brothers are now operating in the galaxy once again, all of his demonic brothers. So he specifically lists Magnus, Angron, Fulgrim, and Mortarion, but he does say all of his demonic brothers are acting in the galaxy once again, although we haven't really seen anything from Perturabo and Lorgar yet. But in this book, we get to see the Death Guard striking out into the galaxy once again, and they've always been a blight on the Imperium, but Mortarion is very annoyed since the return of his brother, and so he's having the Death Guard conduct assaults here, there, and everywhere. I will say this book is a 10 out of 10 because it's probably the best depiction of the Death Guard I think that we've seen in 40k. Vork's the leader of this Lords of Silence warband. He actually has them attack Sabantine, which is the homeworld of the White Consul Space Marine chapter, and he does this with the Word Bearers, but ultimately, the Word Bearers and the Death Guard come into conflict themselves. The Death Guard come out on top. They disrupt this ritual of the Word Bearers, and the Death Guard are able to turn this planet into basically a copy of their homeworld, the Plague Planet. And so it's a great victory for the Death Guard. But this book is very popular with Death Guard fans because it does Warhammer horror so well. You kind of get these really cool depictions talking about almost sort of linking ideas of depression and loneliness and guilt with chaos corruption, which is very fitting for what it means to be in the Death Guard, very fitting for what it means to follow Nurgle, the god of despair. So very cool. So I think that this book is a 10 out of 10 because it's just such a well-written book. I appreciate I will probably get some stick for giving too many things 10s out of 10. I will try not to do that, but Chris Wright wrote a lot of these books, and if anyone wants to say Chris Wright's a bad author. The next book, which is a must-read in terms of how necessary it is for the setting, if you're someone that is very new to 40k, this is a pretty good place to start if you don't want to start right at the start. The Avenging Son by Guy Haley. I'll give it a 9 out of 10. The reason I'll knock a point off is purely because it is a little bit challenging in terms of there are a lot of characters in this book. So this book properly goes into detail on Guilliman's new Space Marine armies, which are known as the Primaris Space Marines. So it turns out that in the 10,000 years since Guilliman's been asleep, his servants have been working for him. In particular, a Archmagus Dominus known as Belisarius Cawl. He is a very important character within the setting. So it turns out that 10,000 years ago, Guilliman gave Belisarius Cawl 2 great tasks. Yes, this guy is 10,000 years old. The first task was to find a way to revive a Primarch should he fall, and the second was to try and improve upon the Emperor's Space Marine design. And he basically does this by creating 3 new new organs for the Space Marines. So Space Marines have 18 organs historically, and that's what grants them their superhuman abilities, but he comes up with 3 additional ones, and this is what turns the Space Marine into the Primaris Space Marine. To start with, these are just new Space Marines, but over time you will see that a lot of your favorite Space Marine characters, like Lieutenant Titus, they go through a bit of a transformation, they become a bit taller, they get a bit of different armor, and that's because they have become Primaris Space Marines. So cool's been a big deal for 10,000 years, and in the book, Guy Haley reveals the Primaris Marines for the first time chronologically. And we actually see this happen in front of like huge crowds because Guilliman has to play politics very carefully in this book. One of the charges against Guilliman in not just the Horus Heresy, but the Great Crusade and always, is that he is a legion builder. He is someone that wants to be a mini emperor. He is someone that might want to break away from the Imperium of Man. And so the fact that he has created massive amounts of Space Marines, or they've been created for him basically in secret, is something he has to be very careful with. However, they've also come at a very crucial time. They have come at the time when the Great Rift has opened, the Imperium is beset on all sides, and so he wants to begin the Indomitus Crusade. This crusade to try and regain as much ground with the Imperium as possible, to try and find a way to pull the Imperium back from the brink and hopefully close the Cicatrix Maledictum, hopefully reunite all the lost worlds of the Imperium under one banner. Now, this starts off the Dawn of Fire series. The reason it's called the Dawn of Fire series is because the Dawn of Fire is the name of Rabute Guilliman's flagship. Previously, his flagship was a massive vessel known as the Macragge's Honor. However, the Ultramarines lost this when Guilliman went on the Terran Crusade, as in when he left Macragge for the first time in 10,000 years to come back to Terra to speak with his father. He lost it to Red Corsairs and Kairos Fateweaver, a very powerful demon who had basically ensnared Guilliman. And so they managed to make it back to Terra, but their main flagship was lost. And so Guilliman takes the Dawn of Fire, this new vessel, as his flagship henceforth. And from that, he conducts his crusade within the Imperium of Man. Guilliman creates multiple fleets for the Indomitus Crusade. They will spread out and are massive levels of ships, fleets. It's the greatest armada ever assembled since the Great Crusade. And so Guilliman is pretty much the last hope of humanity. And that's where all this begins. The Dawn of Fire series is its own thing. There are 9 books, and they are of mixed quality, and we'll go through all of them today to some degree. This book, I would say, is like a 9 out of 10. I would say that you really should read it because it's really foundational to modern Warhammer 40k lore. It is quite a lot. There's a lot of characters because you get introduced to new commanders. Arios is this new Space Marine captain that you can see here. Well, he's actually not a captain at this point, but yeah, you get introduced to Belisarius Cawl, Alpha Primus, all of these random characters that are seemingly very important, but they don't get very much attention in the book. But Guy Haley is just writing kind of foundational lore here, so he has to breeze through things very quickly. As do I. So let's carry on. After Avenging Son, Rabute Guilliman decides that someone's got to go back to Macragge just to make sure everything is okay. And so he actually sends one of his most famous sons. He sends Cato Sicarius. This was an interesting book to put on this list, Knights of Macragge. The reason it's quite interesting is because a lot of these books are very kind of fundamental to the setting. That's why I've kind of given them high ratings. But this isn't all of the books within the Indomitus period. And the ones that aren't included, I presume aren't included because they're not as fundamental to the story. But Knights of Macragge is also really not. So in short, this story is basically about how Cato Sicarius, he gets kind of incredibly lost. So he's sent off with a fleet and with lots of Primaris Marines who, of course, have just been revealed to the Imperium, as I say. And when the Astronomicon has a bit of an issue, his ship basically gets lost. And when it reappears in real space, it's very far from where they intended to be. So they land on this planet that has not really heard of the Imperium, doesn't really know what it is. So they call themselves the Knights of Macragge, the Knights of this land called Macragge. And they, of course, seem like incredibly powerful warriors, very obviously. And they're very necessary because the world is being attacked by orcs. But in addition to that, it turns out that the leader of the planet is being controlled by the Necrons, and so they have to destroy Catan, they have to basically save the planet, and that's pretty much the story that happens here. I would give this book probably like a 5 out of 10. It's one of Nick Kime's best writing. I actually have a soft spot for Sicarius. Historically, Sicarius in other novels is a very arrogant character, doesn't take criticism very well at all, and always thought he'd be one of the greatest warriors of the Imperium, so other Ultramarines don't really like him very much. This book is part of a series that sort of sees his humbling, and post Knights of Macragge, he's a much more chill guy, and he's one of those Space Marines that has a genuine kind of cool story arc, I would guess, in that respect. I would say, of the books on this list, this is definitely one you can skip. If you're a big Ultramarines fan, if you love Space Marine 2, you'll probably enjoy it, which leads us on to the second Dawn of Fire novel, which is called The Gate of Bones. This leads us into the second big plot line that we're going to talk about today, and that is involving the Word Bearers and their mysterious activities. And in particular, in this book, there's a very powerful artifact known as the Ring of Bucaris, which is the ring of a fallen Imperial cult, a member called Bucaris a long time ago, and it's very powerful. And they basically use this weapon to create sort of a big ghost cannon. And this weapon is so powerful, it is sort of able to just blow things out of the sky. It nearly kills Guilliman. It's incredibly devastating weapon. You get a team of custodians being deployed in this book, which is pretty cool. You also have the Mordians in this series. They come up again later. They're a lot of fun. They're very morbid. So many of them commit suicide. They literally ban the word suicide because it's just so horrible being in the Imperium of Man. In this book, the Imperial Fists, they're new Imperial Fist. They're Primaris Marines. So they don't have the history of the Imperial Fist chapter sort of beaten into them as the other Imperial Fists might do. But yet still, when they see the Iron Warriors in this book, they become filled with rage, which is quite funny because it's like a biological instinct, I guess. But yes, I'd probably give that one 6 out of 10. I would say you probably need to read it for other books, but I don't think it's one that I particularly enjoyed. Then another Chris Wright novel, The Regent Shadow. So this is the second Watchers of the Throne series. I spoke earlier about Rabute Guilliman reforming the High Lords of Terra. And in this book, we see the consequences of this. So the Reformed Council are now in charge. However, this means that some people have been kicked off the High Lords of Terra, and they're not happy about this. So you see, once Guilliman has left to go and conduct his Indomitus crusade, they want to try and retake control of Terra, knowing that Guilliman won't be back for a really long time, and when he comes back, he's going to have to assail the planet, so kicking them off again might be more trouble than it's worth. So they make a ploy to take over the Imperium again. And the Custodians' role in this is sort of fascinating because the Custodians as a faction, they are the bodyguards of the Emperor. They are loyal to the Emperor. They're not loyal to Guilliman. And some of them really don't like Guilliman. And so it's not clear as you read the book whether Trajan Valoris, the Captain General of the Custodians, whether he's going to actually intervene here. And in addition, you have other very powerful factions. You have the Assassins, and the Officio Assassinorum is based on Terra, and this is again a massively powerful force. So who are these people going to side with? The Renegade High Lords, they actually draw in support from a chapter of Space Marines known as the Minotaurs chapter, who are a very mysterious Space Marine chapter that was spoken about in the Thunder Warriors video. In this book, they come to Terra and they come to blows with Custodians and with Imperial Fists who have come back to Terra. So the civil war is breaking out on Terra as the ex-High Lords of Terra make their play to retake control of the Imperium. So it is sort of a nightmare. However, in the end, it turns out that Valoris, the Assassins, they're actually loyal to not just Guilliman, but really the Emperor's vision. And they realize that Guilliman is the best person to lead that vision. And so they end up taking out the High Lords of Terra that are renegade. The Minotaurs are sent home. And thankfully calm, relative calm, returns to the Imperium of Man. So the High Lords of Terra have been properly replaced now, and this is sort of the biggest change that has happened to the Imperium since Guilliman's come back, because these characters here that you can see in this image are generally speaking kind of good. You have Trajan Valoris, who we haven't seen much on even to this day, but he seems like a relatively intelligent guy. You have Solar Leontus, he's had a book. You've had Morven Val, she's had a book, and they seem pretty competent at what they do. They have definitely made mistakes, but they're not as actively corrupt as the High Lords of Terra were before Guilliman came back. Terra is in a reasonably good place. The rebellion has been quashed. Alea and Valerian were critical in the Indomitus launch. They were critical to the Indomitus launch. One of the Alea and Valerian storylines that's very cool is they sort of uncover the story of what happens to the Sisters of Silence, because the Sisters of Silence are critical to the Imperium in terms of they gather the souls on the black ships to feed the Emperor of Mankind, these kind of psychic souls that the Emperor devours. However, they've been decreasing in number a lot over the last 10,000 years, and it turns out there's been a bit of a conspiracy to reduce their numbers. So they kind of uncover why this has happened, and ultimately, with the return of Rabute Guilliman, you also see this reflourishing of not just the Custodians striking out into the galaxy, but the Sisters of Silence numbers are now starting to increase again. Up next, we have a true anomaly in Warhammer 40k, Ephrael Stern. Again, an interesting book to have on this list because neither of the High Lords of Terra novels are on this list. So I was surprised to see this come up, but I mean, Ephrael Stern is a really interesting character. So, Ephrael Stern, if you're not familiar, the reason she's an anomaly is because the Sisters of Battle, they don't have psychers. And whilst she is not really a psyker, because she sort of has uber faith abilities, she is still a heretic in a lot of ways in the eyes of many of her sisters. So the reason I say she's not really a psyker is because even though she has a lot of abilities that appear to be very similar to like psyker abilities, like she can send blasts at people and that kind of thing, her abilities are specifically said to be empowered by faith. And faith in the Emperor of Mankind. Faith is a very peculiar concept. It's a bit of a pain in Warhammer because it sort of breaks all the rules of Warhammer. So historically, we used to sort of view faith as kind of like a collective psychic ability. The reason psychers have psychic powers in 40k is because psychers have very large souls that burn very brightly in the warp. However, even though you might not have a bright soul like that, you might still get some kind of cool abilities, because if everybody else believes the same thing as you, then that creates a reflection in the warp, which might then empower you. And so you can kind of be empowered by your faith in the Emperor, for example, or a being from that realm who kind of puts their power into you. So that's typically how faith is described by people like Malkador in the setting. However, we'll talk more about this later, but Ephrael Stern's abilities are even more powerful than Psyker abilities in that they don't have the same drawbacks that as other Psykers seem to have, at least not nearly as much. And so she's incredibly powerful. She seems to be some sort of special servant of the Emperor. She's actually a very old character within the setting in that she used to even have a comic book series. It's very dark. If you've never read that comic book series, I might go through it one day. There are some crazy scenes in that, but famously a cage made of Sisters of Battle, and she actually has an ally, a Harlequin, who has sort of left the Harlequins and is working with her. Now, in this novel, Ephrael Stern, the Heretic Saint, we actually see her taking the fight to the forces of chaos. So she allies with an Inquisitor. She actually has a vision of the Emperor falling. She ultimately goes to a planet that is being controlled by these word bearers, and in particular a very powerful Master of Possession. Now the Master of Possession actually seeks to have Ephrael Stern fall so that she will become a true heretic saint. She will become a saint of chaos because her power is sort of so unique and powerful. But ultimately her faith in the Master of Mankind allows like his power basically to kind of be pulled into this shrine and blow up the word bearers and the forces. So she ultimately comes out on top, and the book ends with her having another vision where she's pulled towards an area of nothingness, which will take us to the Pariah Nexus, which we'll talk about in a bit. Everyone was captured by the word bearers and broke free by noticing he had doubt, and that was kind of cool. That is cool because, of course, her faith in the Emperor of Mankind is unwavering. So yeah, it's good. I would give this book probably a 7 out of 10. I wouldn't say it's a must read because you don't miss out a lot of stuff, but she's an exception to the rule in Warhammer 40k, and the exceptions to the rule are always pretty interesting. She's a cool character, and it was nice to see her properly come back a few years ago and get a lot more attention, because she's from the days of 40k's history when things were quite a lot darker. Anyway, next book. This is probably going to be the lowest rated one on the list for me personally. This book annoyed me in a lot of ways. It's called The Wolf Time. As much as, you know, YouTubers might be annoying for how they use clickbait, this book is an insane clickbait, because The Wolf Time, if you're not familiar, is the name of the period wherein Leman Russ will return to the Imperium of Man, and he will lead his sons forward to fight in the name of the Allfather. When he left the Imperium, he said that he would return in the Wolf Time. And so calling your book Wolf Time, people were very excited for this novel. People were thinking this is going to be everything. And it's just Space Wolves being Space Wolves. So in this story, you have the Space Wolves who are quite close to extinction, really. They have been involved in a series of very big wars that not only was Fenris itself, their home, besieged by Magnus the Red, and they ended up needing support from like the Dark Angels, and ultimately they would win, but they'd lose a lot of their brothers. They were also involved in the fall of Cadia, etc. And we've had the Great Rift open, so many Space Wolves have died. I think they're down to about 300. If I remember, I read this book a long time ago, if I remember correctly. So in this story, when Rabute Guilliman comes to them with all of these new Primaris Marines, he offers them a chance to rebuild not just their chapter, but sort of their legion, because they don't like Guilliman. You have to remember that, because Guilliman is the person who made it so that the legions could no longer exist in their previous forms. You could no longer have a force of 100,000 Space Marines, because Guilliman deemed that that force was too powerful for any one person to control, so he broke the legions up into chapters. The Space Wolves have never liked this, because even though they don't have successors, or at least they didn't, they were limited on the number of Space Marines they could have, and people would stop them from recruiting more Space Marines. So when Guilliman comes to them, they're really annoyed, because they're like, look, it's the Legion Breaker, hate this guy, and they're all very grumpy with him, and which is just a classic Space Wolf thing. And the Space Wolves are often very angry people, but normally you have the sensible one. You have, normally it'd be someone like Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who, when the Space Wolves are pulled into conflict with the Inquisition, the Space Wolves, they're fighting the Grey Knights, and then Bjorn sort of teleports onto the ship and is like, everybody stop. And Bjorn's the kind of aura of calm. But even Bjorn in this book is just full of rage, and everyone's really angry at Guilliman. And you do get to see Guilliman play ultimate politician. What he actually does is bow to the Wolf King, Logan Grimnar, and it's sort of a really cool political play, and ultimately brings the Space Wolves back into the fold. But as you can hear in that story, there's actually nothing about Leman Russ. They do have a discussion on the concept of the Wolf Time. As I remember, they discuss, is it the Wolf Time? To which the answer is no. They discuss, is it near the Wolf Time? To the answer is maybe. And should we prepare for the Wolf Time? To which the answer is yes, of course. But that has always been the case. So it was very kind of annoying to call this book The Wolf Time and just sort of see the Space Wolves being exceptionally difficult as they are wont to be. I didn't think it really did them justice, and I was not a massive fan of it. So I'll give this book like a 4 out of 10. But yeah, there is a cool plot line where you have a Primaris Space Marine who's seeking to earn the respect of the Space Wolves, and so he conducts this like trial on Fenris to make it however many hundreds of miles on his own, or with the support of the local Fenrisians, and he goes on a really cool little adventure. But yeah, that's about it. It's also barely connected to the Dawn of Fire series, because as you can see, this is a Dawn of Fire novel, but whereas the first one sets up the setting and the second one sets up this kind of big storyline involving the Wordbearer's plans and this kind of Ring of Bucharest, this book basically is not connected. There is a custodian who is seeking information on connected to what the Wordbearers have done and connected to the Indomitus Crusade, but it's a very loose connection. So this book really should have just been a standalone novel, and if it had been, I think it would have been much better, because it should have just been a book about the Space Wolves and their relationship with Guilliman, and you could have made it much more interesting in that respect. But yes, so definitely probably my least favorite of the books we've looked at today. The next book we're going to look at is the third Vaults of Terror book, The Dark City by Chris Raitt. This was a 10 out of 10. This book is crazy. It concludes this big plot line. Well, it's still open at the end of this book, really, but it's the end of this big plot line, as far as we know, for the High Lords of Terror who were seeking, who were, it's the end of this High Lords of Terror plotline, this conspiracy that they've been conducting, as far as we know, where they have been working with the Drukhari. So it turns out in this book that the reason the Drukhari have been working with the High Lords of Terror is because the High Lords of Terror are seeking a way to save the Golden Throne. It turns out the Golden Throne is failing, which has often been something in the background of the setting, hinted at from here, there, and everywhere, hinted that like people have visions of the Golden Throne failing and that kind of thing. However, it's confirmed that not only is the Golden Throne failing, but the Golden Throne will fail in about 100 years, but 200 years max. The main person in charge of keeping the Golden Throne running is the Fabricator General of Mars, and he conducted an analysis to think who would actually work with me to help save the Golden Throne, because the High Lords of Terror are so crap, or were so crap, that he didn't want to introduce all of them into this problem, because he thought it would get so many people would make their plays for power and would try to take as much advantage as they can, that ultimately nothing would get solved. So he conducted an analysis to see who would actually be who can actually work with him, and there were two other High Lords of Terror that would do, and so one of them was killed in the previous novel, one of them leaves the conspiracy. So by the time we get to this third book, it's just the Fabricator General of Mars. However, his first plan, which is what turns out the first book was about, was to bring a Drukhari homunculus to Terra so that they could kind of like examine the Golden Throne and maybe fix things if they need to. However, the homunculus broke free, caused absolute havoc. But the Fabricator General of Mars is still out of options, because the Golden Throne is such an ancient thing. It's rumored, it's sort of implied to have been created by the Old Ones, that it's beyond humanity even at its peak. A lot of people will say the Golden Throne is from the Dark Age of Technology, or it's made from Dark Age of Technology tech. And to be fair, that's what people thought for a long time in the setting. And even to this day, that's how a lot of 40k books talk about it. But he reveals in this book, it's actually pretty much entirely Xenos in origin. And that's why only the Emperor understood, even sort of understood, the tech behind the Golden Throne and could turn it into what it is. So the Fabricator General, discovering that the Golden Throne needs to be favoured, even though the Drukhari have already sort of betrayed him once, pushes forward with this plan to work with the Drukhari. And this book concludes with the Inquisitor Erasmus Crowell, his retinue, and the custodians under a custodian called Nevradaran, who's been in the other books as well. They end up going into the webway. They find the Fabricator General, who's in like a meeting spot waiting for the Drukhari, and they've got components of the Golden Throne that have failed, and they want the Drukhari to fix these components. Now, you may be wondering what's in it for the Drukhari, why they would do this, because the Drukhari are evil, brutal Xenos. And initially, it said that the Imperium would sign over like something like 10 million souls to the Drukhari. That's what they would give the Drukhari in as payment for this work. But it actually turns out there's a much more nefarious plot at work, because the Drukhari are also facing their own problems. So yes, it's true to say that the Imperium is suffering from the Cicatrix Maledictum and the Great Rift, but the Great Rift has also affected their home of Commorragh, and it has weakened the barriers protecting Commorragh, because their home exists within the webway, and the webway exists, is usually described, it's a bit of a metaphor, but it's described as being between reality and the warp, and it's weakening the barriers around Commorragh, meaning that demons are spilling into this city. And what the Drukhari have decided is that they want their own Golden Throne, because they see the Emperor can close warp rifts, and so they want to create their own version of the Golden Throne and their own version of the Emperor. And what the Inquisitor finds this out in the novel, and he tells the custodians this and everybody this. The custodians disrupt the meeting, destroy all of the components containing bits of the Golden Throne, because they would have cells of the Emperor on them and end this and end this meeting. So not only So the outcome of this novel is devastating for all sides. The Drukhari have, as far as we know, no way to actually save their home. The Commorragh is going to be overrun by demons unless they do something big, which will be a plotline for another day. But the Imperium, the Golden Throne is failing. Everybody is killed, as far as we know. We don't see what happens to the custodians. We know that the Inquisitor and his retinue die. Only his servo skull makes it out of the webway, which does have information. So hopefully he can get information back to Terra. But also the Fabricator General of Mars, it's now been confirmed, died in that book, meaning that the person who was in charge of saving the Golden Throne has died. But also, after he dies, the entire planet of Mars falls into crisis, because all of a sudden they've got no leader. This leader, Udi Araskian, the Fabricator General, has been alive for thousands of years. He's now dead, and so there's a succession crisis. And it turns out that with the Mechanicus have now come to the conclusion that they can't save the Emperor, they can't save the Golden Throne, so they're just waiting for the Emperor to die now. They're not telling anyone about it. The Custodians probably know, but the Mechanicus aren't saving the Emperor. They're just waiting for the Emperor to die, and then they want to make their own Martian Empire. The ramifications of this book are devastating for the entire setting. And so, Chris Raitt, we need you back, bud. We need you to write a fourth book here, because someone has to save the Emperor. As I say, it's said he's got 200 years max. It's probably about 100. If you can't save the Emperor, the Imperium is lost. It's pretty bad. And we don't know who can do it. If the Drukhari can't save the Emperor, maybe the Eldar can, maybe the Votann can. There's a lot of maybes, but there's really no certainties here. And Games Workshop are going to have to fix this at some point, because if the Emperor can't die, that's very much the end of the setting. So the big plot line, and the fallout from this is brutal. As far as we have it right now, the Golden Throne is failing. As far as we know, no one can mix it, and as far as we know, no one can fix it, and someone is going to have to step in and stop Mars from rebelling against the Imperium of Man. So it's a scary times for the Imperium. The next book is Throne of Light by Guy Haley. This book, I would say, it's an interesting one to rate, because I would say it's probably about a 7 out of 10. I would give Dark City a 10 if I didn't already explain that. But Throne of Light, I would say, is a 7. It's a must-read in terms of importance to the setting. I wouldn't say it's the best written book on this list or in conjunction with that. The main plot line that sort of goes on is about this Imperial Fist and the Black Templars. This is the book. It's quite famous. You might have heard about it. I've definitely talked about it before, where you have this Black Templars fleet. So this is only a small section of the Black Templars, and it's discovered that they actually killed the Primaris Space Marines that were sent to reinforce them. And so this is uncovered in the book. Those Black Templars do end up all dying fighting against word bearers, but obviously pretty grimdark movement, and something people I think expected, because if you're not familiar, Belisarius' cool improving upon the Space Marine design is heresy in most people's eyes. You can't improve upon something the Emperor made. That's ridiculous. So Black Templars do as Black Templars do. But the main reason this book is important is for the word bearers plot in this book. So this is where the story of the Star Child is properly uncovered and is brought back into modern 40k. So the Star Child is an old Warhammer storyline from decades ago. And it's the idea that some people believe the Emperor will be reborn in the body of a child. This old Warhammer 40k storyline was often connected to things like the Sensei, and these are 40k concepts that are not officially retconned, as in like the writers have never written anything saying that the Sensei weren't real, but 40k as a setting certainly acts like they're not real. As in, when we say children of the Emperor, we typically mean the Primarchs. When we talk about the Emperor's successors, we only really talk about Primarchs. The Sensei are never really brought up on their own. However, in this book, not only is the concept of the Star Child talked about, but they also refer to stories where the Sensei did appear. So this is as close as you get to them being confirmed to still be around. However, the Star Child in this book, it makes a lot of sense now because it's a very kind of different concept, really, because it's not so much about just the Emperor being reborn, but it's about part of the Emperor's soul being reborn. So I've talked about this at length on the channel before. Check my other live streams if you're interested, where in the Horus Heresy, before the Emperor faced his son, he severed off part of his own soul. And it was said this part of his soul was the bit that contained his love, loyalty, and compassion, i.e. the things that could be used against him in his battle versus his son, and the things that would be used to torture him even more if he goes onto the Golden Throne, because he suspected at that point he would be placed onto the Golden Throne. So he severs off these parts of his soul, and they drift into the warp, and Malkador sees them go, and it says they kind of glow like a child star. And it said that they will grow over the next 10,000 years as the Chaos Gods grow. As in, as people worship the Emperor, this part of the Emperor's soul will grow in power. And it looks like that's what's behind a lot of the Imperial Saints, the Legion of the Damned, all this kind of crazy nonsense that happens in the Imperium. And so that part of the Emperor's soul has grown over 10,000 years, and now it's going to find a host within 40k. And so that's what we need. That's like another massive plot line that will happen at some point. There will be a child that will be born with ancient knowledge, that will be born with incredible power, and we don't know exactly how it will happen. There's many theories that I've spoken about, but yeah, it looks like it's going to come up. This book, Throne of Light, is probably the best explanation of where it is currently in 40k. It is referenced in multiple other Dawn of Fire books. The next two are also Dawn of Fire books. In Martyr's Tomb, there's also a vision of like a child of incredible power, and in one of the other books as well, I think it's in Hand of Abaddon again, we get another reference to this idea of the Star Child sort of, and this power of the Emperor returning to the setting, which is just crazy. Can't believe that's happening. So this is a massive plot line that Games Workshop have sort of set up, and we can move forward with at some point in the future. The next books we're going to talk about are probably the books that, if you were reading the Dawn of Fire series, you probably dropped out around this point. This is probably the bit where you were no longer interested, because just as like I talked about with Wolf Time, the Dawn of Fire series kept like running around and having all of these different plot lines, and the Dawn of Fire series thought of itself as the new Horus Heresy, and that's how they sort of sold it. It was going to be the new Horus Heresy, but the Horus Heresy worked because each book pretty much had a character in it that was massively important, that was people would be drawn to. However, if you look at Iron Kingdom, this is a book about a protectorate that is considering moving away from the Imperium, and some random Black Templars and random Black Crusaders and a random Sisters of Battle. It just didn't have really the draw, as does Martyr's Tomb. And so, of course, it was going to always be the case that people weren't that interested in these novels. And I have said this before, but I hope Games Workshop doesn't conclude that the reason these books sold so poorly is because the idea of a new Horus Heresy is bad, but it's because you got to have draws for your books, do you know what I mean? And you got to have a consistent storyline that pulls people in, because people have read Wolf Time by this point, realized this isn't actually a cohesive storyline. These are just random books. Like the Dawn of Fire series might as well just be called like Tales from the Indomitus Crusade. It's not a cohesive arc. And so people sort of just grew less interested and stopped reading. So the next two books, I mean, Iron Kingdom, 5 out of 10. Martyr's Tomb, 3. Just they just weren't particularly compelling. I did like the Red Corsairs in this book, and I did like the fact that they were trying to he comes up again in a later book, Herrick, where he's this Red Corsair who's interested in reclaiming his sword that he'd lost to a Black Templar, which is pretty cool. And then you have Martyr's Tomb. You do have there's a Sister of Battle that was in love with an Imperial Saint, and you have random, pretty random stuff like that. But ultimately, ultimately, I don't think they were particularly good. I think if you're looking for books to skip on this list, these are definitely your ones, to be honest. I won't spend too much time on them because they're not really important to the setting, to be honest with you. Matt, thank you again. Wasn't the Star Child already born? In the visions, there's a child on an island village untouched by galactic war. There are many visions of the Star Child that people have seen, but there's no character in the setting that you can point to yet and say that's the Star Child. It might even be possible that the Star Child has already been born, but as far as we know, it hasn't, I don't think. It's also a bit murky because, for example, in like the books like Plague War, there is a child who is born has incredible powers of the Emperor, but that's not said to be the Star Child. That's just like an Imperial Saint, but still it's a very similar concept. And so it's kind of like Guilliman still goes up to this child and sort of feels his father's power emanating from it, which is a bit funky. So yes, the Sensei will probably be retconned as a group of perpetuals. Yes, that's a good point. I think that's what people really thought had happened there. People thought it would be the case that the Perpetuals were sort of Dan Abnett's replacement of the Sensei, because the concept, this like ancient order that it works in secret, sort of outside of the Imperium, and is loyal to the Emperor. That's sort of what people thought the Perpetuals might be. At least they sort of seem to fulfill a similar-ish role. Or at least, at the very least, Dan Abnett could have just used the Sensei in place of the Perpetuals during the Horus Heresy, and that would have... You would have obviously have to change things, but it would have worked fine, I think. Anyway, I will say, just because it's a bit of a... what's the word I'm looking for? A hint at what's going to come later. In Martyr's Tomb, we do get this Magos who studies the Great Rift, and he has a vision of the Silent King, and the vision kills him. So this idea of the Silent King and the Pariah Nexus becoming more important have been hinted at in a couple of books now, in Ephrael Stern, in Martyr's Tomb, but ultimately there are so many plot lines going on in the setting. I think I kind of missed that when I first read the book. It was only when when I saw the final book was about the Silent King, I was looking for references to the Silent King in the rest of the Dawn of Fire series, and I couldn't think of anything. But that's, yeah, there's so few. The Dawn of Fire series is just all over the place. The next book, Sea of Souls by Chris Ray, I'll give it a 7. It's a fun book. It's like, if you like Warhammer horror, you'll like this book. It turns out that this book is actually connected to the Iron Kingdom plotline and even the Wordbearers plotline, where it turns out one of the things the forces of chaos have been hoping to do is reassemble all the shards of the Anathame, this very powerful weapon that was a sentient blade that brought Horus Lupercal low and ultimately played a key role in turning him towards chaos. So in Sea of Souls, in Iron Kingdom, they find shards of the Anathame and hand them to Abaddon, and Abaddon says, at the end of Iron Kingdom, I think they've got 5. And so he says, 5 down, 3 to go, something like that. And that's pretty much Abaddon's only appearance. Is his only appearance in the Dawn of Fire series, actually, which is, again, very weird. But yes, it turns out at the end of Sea of Souls that what the forces of chaos have been working towards is reassembling all the shards of this very powerful weapon, so they've got a weapon. Presumably that would be powerful enough to bring low Rabute Guilliman, or potentially even the Emperor. But yes, this book is if you like Warhammer horror, you will like this. Rogue traders and getting taken over by malevolent entities, and what it's like going through a ship that's been corrupted. A lot of fun. And Chris Ray is a good author, but certainly I would say this is one to skip, to be honest with you. And it hurts me to say that for a Chris Ray book, but I don't blame him. I blame the Dawn of Fire series. Next, another one you can skip, Indomitus by Gav Thorpe. This book basically just exists to accompany the new models that came out with the Indomitus box. Every new edition of Warhammer 40k, they release a bunch of new models, and usually they release a bunch of new Space Marines. And with the Indomitus box in 9th edition, you've got a whole bunch of new Space Marines, and this book came with it. The book is a story of how all those Space Marines work. There is a new Space Marine rank called the Judiciar, which is like a junior chaplain, basically. And so seeing how he works in the Ultramarines is kind of interesting. But yeah, this is one to skip. I think the only plot line from this I've ever made a video on is the Scorpek Lord, because there is a Scorpek Lord in this book called, I think, Sozar it was, and he was kind of cool because you have him have his visions because he's completely mad, but it turned out he was actually a scientist who played a critical role in working for the Silent King before the Necrons went through biotransference. And so he's kind of tortured by the fact that he created this technology which killed his wife and children, which is pretty brutal. But yeah, definitely not one to skip, I would say, on this list. I'm surprised that this made the list. I guess it's called Indomitus, but even then. Yam, thank you for joining the channel. And thanks, sorry, I should say as well, thank you to all of the well-wishers, people who have said congrats on the wedding. Yes, I have been seeing them. Very, very kind. But I'm conscious I've already taken a long time, so I need to get on. How many books? All right, we're towards the end, I think. Yes. Okay, we're towards the end. Hand of Abaddon. So, I mentioned earlier about the Forces of Chaos hoping to reunite all the shards of the Anathame, and this is the book in which they do it. I've gone through this story a bit before, so definitely check that out on my channel, but I would say this, I'm going to call it a 6 out of 10. No, I think that's probably a bit too generous. I'll call it a 4 out of 10. So, it's not the best written, in my opinion. The reason it's not the best written is because, like a lot of the Dawn of Fire books, it has a lot of characters going on, which is pretty standard. But this book does such a poor job of making it clear what's going on. I had to flip back through things and figure out what was going on when I was reading it, because he just doesn't make clear where people are going, what their aim is, where they are, and even though there are things like that, you get the Red Corsairs that sort of traverse the warp and areas of the warp, it's not that hard to explain to your reader where they're going, what they're trying to do, and I think this book does a poor job of it. Even who characters are fighting, it turns out that 2 main characters of this book fight in the middle, and they don't even reveal who it is. It's just very bizarre writing, because you just think, why don't you just give characters the names that they have? That doesn't make any sense. It was very bizarre. I will say, I did call it at the time when I discussed this book, and it's nice to be proven right, to be honest with you. I did say that the Ultramarines were going to get a new character in the near future, which will almost certainly be Captain Arios, because in this book, the previous captain of the 6th Company dies, and Arios picks up a new thunder hammer and takes vengeance for him, of course, and has a very badass line where he's fighting a Chaos Lord, and the Chaos Lord calls out for his gods, and he says they're not listening, and then crushes his head, which was pretty badass. So yeah, the Ultramarines, you have got a new model because of this, and he's even getting a whole new book, which is interesting. A lot of concentration for a new Space Marine character to get, especially considering we've got Ventress and Sicarius, who were already very big Ultramarines characters, but and Titus, of course. So as an Ultramarines fan, you are eating pretty well. But yeah, I did like the character, and I thought he was pretty cool. He was pretty badass, I'll give you that. But anyway, that takes us... Yes, Hand of Abaddon. Oh yeah, I will talk about Abaddon just a little bit more, because I've spoken about it in other streams, but I'll mention it again. I do think there are things from this book which will almost certainly play up in the future. So the woman on the right-hand side of this... art, she is called Kesh, and she is a Mordian soldier, and she actually ascends to become an Imperial Saint in this book. And in addition to that, there is a Chaos Saint that sort of ascends in this book, because there's another character called Tharador, Yang of Cathalamor, and there's a Chaos Cultist introduced in Gate of Bones called Yang of Cathalamor, and she works for the Word Bearers, and then she starts working for this mysterious Hand of Abaddon, and she ends up basically sort of absorbing the heart of a Blackstone fortress, and she goes through this huge apotheosis and becomes like this new chaos thing that we've never seen before. And I think it's that idea from Ephrael Stern's book, this idea of a chaos saint, because she ends up wielding the reforged Anathame, which does get reforged by the end of the book, and she now wields unimaginable power. So she is going to be a player at some point, but she doesn't appear in the final Dawn of Fire book, which sucks. So at some point Games Workshop will remember she exists, but it's pretty brutal because up until this point, you'll have noticed of all of the books we've talked about today, the Dawn of Fire books are the ones I've probably been harshest on, and the reason for that is because they were the worst. But having invested in them, I did sort of come to like some of the characters that they'd built up, and read books of the with these characters in. I've read multiple books containing these characters, and so then to see Games Workshop just kind of throw them away is it's a bit gutting. But I think that Nick Kime does a good job of coming up with cool ideas for 40k characters, and so yeah, that's not the he's not the best writer, I'll be honest with you, but it's not his character work that's bad. He writes good characters. He just can write. I think he writes poorly in how he writes his how he writes the novel. Yeah, basically. But hey ho. I'm late, so catching up. To me, the Emperor losing years says he's no longer immortal, hence why he hasn't revived. Congrats on the wedding. Might well be connected. Would not surprise me. Wait, what's the difference between a Chaos Saint and a Demon Prince? So she's certainly not a Demon Prince. That's a good question. And I think to your question, you could just say that she's like a Chaos Sorcerer. However, she seems to be something different because she has absorbed this sort of heart of a Blackstone Fortress. She was chosen by all of the Chaos Gods, basically at the start of the novel. So she is now a being of, I think, incredible power. And she wields this weapon, the Anathame, which is supposed to be powerful enough to pierce the Aegis of the Emperor. And in addition to that, it's a weapon that already brought low Horus Lupercal. So she is wielding a weapon that is more powerful than a weapon that, for all intents and purposes, killed a Primarch. So she is, I think, going to go far beyond what we consider just a Chaos Sorcerer. But it's a good question. So, this signifying the end of the Dawn of Fire series. The next book, Huron Blackheart by Mike Brooks. This is a very good book. I give it an 8 out of 10. It's a great depiction of Huron Blackheart. Some people probably won't like this depiction because the internet doesn't like Abaddon, and so people often hype Huron up to like ridiculous degrees because, of course, people like the Badab War. But the truth is, Huron is not this incredible lord that is better than everybody else in the Imperium. And in actual fact, in this book, we see him almost lose the Red Corsairs as a random like traitor blood angel pretty much just takes them from him. It turns out that, as I mentioned earlier, when Guilliman lost the Macragg's honor, it wasn't Huron that did this. It was other Red Corsairs. And so even though the Red Corsairs comes into his sort of armada, he is not the person who controls it. And in addition to that, the Macragg's honor is the goodest boy in the Imperium. It's a ship that, as they try to kind of force it into submission, it ends up basically remaining loyal to the Imperium of Man and to Guilliman, and so they can't really break it into use. So in Huron Blackheart's plan to sort of regain control of the Red Corsairs, he ultimately sacrifices the Macragg's honor and it returns to the Ultramarines, but it's not a massive loss because they couldn't properly utilize it, which is a sort of lovely little bit of lore. I thought that was funny. But in this book, they're of course seeking an ancient chaos artifact, and very powerful Zeech artifact, I think it is, if I remember correctly. And yeah, Huron has to regain control of his legion, which is not great. But he's back in charge now. He's dealt with those that stood against him, and he is, yeah, more powerful than ever. But ultimately, this signifies the end of the Dawn of Fire series, because the Dawn of Fire was the flagship of Rabute Guilliman because he didn't have the Macragg's honor. However, with the Macragg's honor having returned to the Primarch and to the Ultramarines, he no longer needs the Dawn of Fire to be his flagship. Which takes us on quite nicely to The Silent King, the final book of the Dawn of Fire series, because now that Guilliman doesn't need the Macragg's honor, they need to end... No, sorry, because now that Guilliman doesn't need the Dawn of Fire of his flagship... No, one more time. Because now that Guilliman doesn't need the Dawn of Fire as his flagship, they don't really need to have a Dawn of Fire series anymore. And so Guilliman ends up, in this book, pretty much sacrificing the Dawn of Fire book to the Necrons. As you can see, the big bad in this book, the final book of the Dawn of Fire series, are the Necrons. The forces of the Imperium, multiple Crusade fleets, are pulled towards the Pariah Nexus. The Pariah Nexus is an area of space that is dominated by the Zaraken dynasty and the Nihilek dynasty, who are sworn to them. And they have created an area of nothingness, basically, is the way Ephrael Stern refers to it, because you have this area that has all these Necron pylons, and just like how with Chaos, and just like how with Cadia, these Necron pylons kind of prevented the warp from spilling over into our reality, they went even further with the Pariah Nexus, the Necrons, and like severed the warp's connection to reality. And so you have this area of space where Psykers can't really use their abilities, at least unless you're very, very powerful, and even human souls are sort of cut off from them, and that really affects people when they're in this zone. And in addition to that, Guilliman and Belisarius Cawl are very interested in this realm because, of course, they want to understand this technology. They want to understand how the Necrons are able to control the flow of the warp into our reality, because they would like to close the Great Rift. This book is a massive loss for the Imperium. The Necrons are made to be very clear as an enemy that is so far beyond the Imperium of Man. Guilliman has no hope right now. There's nothing he can do. The Necrons are practically innumerable. They have technology that goes far beyond humanity at its peak, and they have been working sort of in secret for a while, because it turns out in this book that Guilliman's very angry because the other members of the Mechanicus have been hiding the true nature of the Necrons and just how strong they are for a while now, and they have, therefore that means the Imperium is largely unprepared for them. So when the Necrons and the Imperium do battle in space, it's just the Necrons just carve them up. It's really brutal scene. So I will do a video on Guilliman and the Silent King's actual meeting. They only very briefly meet at the end of the book, but it was a really weird way to end the series. It was cool. It's quite well connected to the first Dawn of Fire book, because of course you have Cawl and Guilliman in it again. Characters like Alpha Primus make an appearance. Characters like Messinius, who's this white consul who's been in like all of the books. He's of course in it as well. And so it connects to the first one, but it's not really connected to the rest of the series. It's the weirdest series they've done. It's so strange. But yes, the main thing to take away from this book is that the Necrons are up and at 'em, and the Imperium is just not prepared for them. There is even the Dark Age of technology tech is just Cawl says it's not comparable to the Silent King's technology. So it's brutal. But Guilliman, I will say Guilliman does get a good showing. So Guilliman is incredibly, to a fault, he is willing to sacrifice himself in this book. It's kind of crazy. So when the Imperium makes its move on the Pariah Nexus, the Necrons kick their ass, and in order to save a bunch of the ships that are being, and the people that are being killed by the Necrons, I think it's about 10 million people are left, Guilliman is willing to sacrifice himself and the Dawn of Fire to sort of bait the Necrons and the Silent King into attacking him, so that the rest of the Indomitus Crusade fleets can pull back. And the reason he's willing to do this is because even though he's incredibly important to the Imperium, he says that there is no point him running away, because if he runs away, the worlds of the Imperium will rebel. If he runs away, what's kind of the point? And the Custodians are, of course, furious about this. Maldavar Kolquan, who is a Custodian who's been in many of the Dawn of Fire books and hates Guilliman pretty much. That's why he's been following Guilliman, is because Valoris wants someone following Guilliman who's going to criticize him and ultimately try and kill him if he betrays the Emperor. He ends up he has a hilarious relationship with Guilliman, because he's been doing we see him in one of the earlier novels, Wolf Time, where he does a simulation trying to kill Guilliman, seeing if he can kill Guilliman. How close would he have to be to Guilliman to kill him? How close would the Emperor have to be? How close would Guilliman have to be to the Emperor before they step in. You know, all of these sorts of simulations they've been running on killing Guilliman, and Guilliman knows this, and he knows how hostile the custodians have been to him, but still the custodians are committed to saving his life because they still believe he is probably the best hope for the Imperium of Man. And when he sacrifices himself, they're like, you're an idiot, why are you doing this? You know, and yes, it's a fascinating relationship. I'll probably do a whole video on the custodians and Guilliman at some point because it's very funny. But yeah, such a good book. Guilliman, incredibly noble. I will say there is the Imperium does stand a chance against the Necrons because they have to, or else the setting would be too dull. And it even says that the forces of the Necrons are actually afraid of Guilliman. And in addition, it's sort of implied that Guilliman might be able to kill the Silent King. Problem with killing the Silent King is that if you kill him, you just kill his body. His mind goes into like the Necron Wi-Fi, and then will be reborn on another tomb world. So you can't properly kill the Silent King. However, Guilliman's sword, the sword of the Emperor, has the ability to destroy souls, and it's revealed in this book. It seems to have an effect on the Necrons as well. So I think it's possible. Should we ever see an end times of 40k, Guilliman is the one you want facing the Silent King, because I think the Emperor's Sword might be able to do it. It might be able to actually kill him outright, which would be very important. So I hope we get an expansion on that in the future, at least just an explanation of whether it can happen, which is really cool. And yeah, there's a lot from this book. I've spoken a bit about the how Mars is potentially going to rebel against the Imperium. That's revealed in this book. The many people on Mars are really preparing for civil war at this point in time. Belisarius Cawl is being kept in the dark because no one really likes him on Mars. So it's a whole thing. I will definitely talk about this book more this week, but stay tuned. Sari, thank you for the gift memberships. Please thank Sari if she gave you one, and join the Discord as well. Tanjim, thank you for the super chat, bro. Great stuff, my man. I highly recommend the books via Audible, as it's the only reliable way I can get most of the Black Library books. Yes, I should say, in fact, all of this art is the Audible art. I will typically read the books without Audible, and the only reason I do that is because it makes making videos much easier, because you can't control F in an Audible. That's the problem. That's the issue that you have. But yes, Audible is totally a valid way to consume all of these, and I think occasionally they make some changes, but yeah, it's basically the same. Yes, would be kind of hilarious if 99% of the Tomb World Necrons are just rusted up by function. I think there's definitely a bit of that. Like, a lot of them, far more of them broke than they intended. But they do create a projection. There's a big meeting to discuss the Necrons in this novel, a convocation. And there's a projection that I think it's about a quarter of Imperial space they think might be Tomb Worlds, something like that, which is a ridiculous amount of Necrons if that's true. So no idea. I guess another advantage the Imperium does have is that the Necrons will have their own civil war. So that's the other thing you've got to bear in mind. In addition, you're going to have to pull the Necrons and the Tyranids into conflict at some point, because they will likely both have identified that they're the greatest threat to one another. It is said it was the Silent King's vision of the Necron, it is said that it was the Silent King's vision of the Tyranids that forced him to return to our galaxy. So they'll probably fight as well. And one reason this book is very confusing is because there is another Silent King campaign going on right now that is also about the Prior Nexus, also contains Guilliman, and also contains Belisarius Cawl. That is not this story. That is a very confusing thing to say. I don't know why they've done this way, but it's important to understand that this story is set long before the Return of the Lion. So you have to remember that. So after this story, Guilliman and Belisarius Cawl, they lose, they retreat, and they're going to come back in the current up-to-date 40k timeline. So there will be another Prior Nexus story in the future with the same characters in the same place. I have no idea why they did it this way. And it's even got, like, this book references Ephrael Stern. Ephrael Stern's a big part of the campaign as well. I don't know why they've done this. This was so strange. I don't know what they were thinking. It was so unnecessary for them to do this. But hey ho. Yeah, so if you're not familiar, the Prior Nexus campaign is a current massive campaign, and in that you have the Necron Civil War sort of starting. You have the Silent King drawn to fight Imatek the Stormlord, who was before the Silent King return was the big bad of the Necrons, and so they're fighting the Mechanicus have rocked up. They're chucking all these Dark Age of technology weapons at the Necrons. The Silent King, it doesn't even care about them at first. He's just not fussed about them. And then you have Ephrael Stern, a bunch of other forces, and then Vashdor rocks up towards the end of the campaign with the reformed world. What's it called? Not Driftwood. Oh God, I'm having a complete mindfuck here. Sorry, chat, help me. What's it called? Wormwood. There we go. Not Driftwood, Wormwood. Vashdor rocks up with Wormwood. He's getting involved in the Prior Nexus campaign, and at the end of the campaign, it's said that like Guilliman's on his way. So the Prior Nexus campaign is kicking off again. So even though this story is sort of not important in terms of it took place a long time ago, I'd still recommend you reading it. I'd give it a 7 out of 10 because there were lots of cool moments, and I would say it does a good job of explaining how Guilliman intends to save the Imperium, the relationship between the Necrons and the Imperium, and also what the fuck is going on with the Mechanicus, because Games Workshop I think Games Workshop have finally figured out what they're going to do with the Mechanicus going forward, which I'll talk about later this week, I think. You keep forgetting about the end of Godblight, where Colquhoun basically says his thoughts on Guilliman have changed. Interesting you say that. That book happens after this. So that's why I haven't mentioned Godblight whatsoever. But we will get there pretty shortly. In fact, this is nice. So I'll go into that now. So what's weird, the reason this book takes place before the current storyline, or quite a long while before it, is because the timeline of 40k got sort of thrown into craziness a while ago. So when Rabute Guilliman returned, the initial series they wrote was the Dark Imperium series, which is the next series on this list we're going to talk about. However, then Games Workshop realized that they'd pushed the timeline forward too much. And so ultimately, they had to sort of go back and explain what happened when Guilliman came to Terra and everything. So the timeline got all kind of thrown into hell. And so that meant that ultimately they had to... and so all of these books were written crazy out of order, to the degree that the second to last book on this list is Devastation of Baal, and that book could arguably be the first book on this list. It was the first of these that were written, and parts of it take place before even Carrion Throne. So it's a really weird list, but yes, it is kind of the core 40k storylines. But yes, so in Dark Imperium, Guilliman returns to his homeworld of Macragge, to the 500 worlds. Guilliman very much regrets breaking up the 500 worlds because he was always concerned that everyone thought he was a mini emperor and wanted to betray the Imperium. So he actually broke up his 500 worlds. But now he misses home, so he's gone back, and he has to, because his evil brother Mortarion has returned. And Mortarion has always hated Macragge because he hates its kind of perfect nature. It's said he hates the fact that it's basically just space Rome. And so we get 3 books, the Dark Imperium series, which are definitely must reads. I'd probably put all of them like 9s out of 10. I think that they are very good. I think they are must reads if you're a 40k fan. And it's Primarch battles, right? You're going to love it. You're going to always love Primarch fans. We get to see Guilliman perma-killing greater demons. We get to see Guilliman and Mortarion fighting multiple times. We get Mortarion and his difficult son, Typhus, trying to get along. We get to see Mortarion torturing the soul of his own father. Marnia's Calgar is now just like an ineffective mayor of a town that no one needs anymore. It's a kid series, and it's a lot of fun. And like weirdly, a lot of these stories do follow on from the Dawn of Fire series. So you do still have the Eldar Farseer, Ilian the Tarsate in this book. You do still have Maldavar Colquhoun in this series. And like they've learned a lot about Guilliman by this point. So the Eldar keep pointing out that Guilliman keeps needing them to save him, which now makes sense because they've saved Guilliman multiple times in this story. And in addition to that, Maldevar Colquhoun has noted that his opinions on Guilliman have now softened. And it's quite funny. You get this really funny explanation where Colquhoun says that he believes that Guilliman is a nice guy. Like, he believes that Guilliman is a nice guy, and so in that respect, he wouldn't want to take over the Imperium. But he believes that Guilliman is so nice that he will inevitably try to take over the Imperium, because he will inevitably come to believe that the Imperium will be better off under his rule. And that is why Guilliman will inevitably betray the Emperor. He's a very difficult man. As a custodian, he does a lot of mental gymnastics. I reference the Dark Imperium series quite a lot. Not only do you have some really interesting plot lines, but there's a couple of things that they discuss that are super pivotal to the setting. The first is the Emperor a god? And this is literally a discussion in the final book of the series, Godblight, where Guilliman speaks to not just the Eldar, but also Grey Knight about the nature of his father, and is his father a god? And in actual fact, Guilliman has some sons, like the White Consuls, who sort of treat the Emperor as a god, and he's not entirely sure the degree to which he should condemn them. Because the Emperor looks like a god, acts like a god, maybe he's sort of a god. And he even reads the Lectitio Divinitatis, the book written by his horrible brother Lorgar. So it's a really important book to read in that respect. I've definitely gone through that story before. And then I've also done a video on the great climax of the series, where Guilliman is defeated by Mortarion, injected with this venom known as the Godblight. And the Godblight is such a powerful poison, it even could kill a Primarch. However, then, as Guilliman's soul is pulled into the Garden of Nurgle, he is filled with the power of the Emperor of Mankind, rises up once more, tells Nurgle he's going to find Nurgle and kill him, and then he burns the Garden of Nurgle and sends Mortarion back to his master, and Mortarion is thereafter punished for a very long time. So it is a hell of a way to finish a series, and very good. Loved the series. Fantastic. Would recommend everybody read. Do you think an Imperium civil war might be on the cards with Lionel in building a mini empire out in the other side of the rift? I don't think so. I don't think that would be the course of a civil war, but I do think you will see some sort of mini civil war at some point. There's definitely options. You could do something like that, and I certainly think that in terms of civil war, one of the things that comes up in the Dark Imperium series towards the end is that a book is discovered. A book called The Reign of Sanguinius, the reign of the Emperor Sanguinius. And this is a reference to a Horus Heresy storyline called The Unremembered Empire, which is the story of how Rabute Guilliman made Sanguinius the Emperor in this region of space called the Unremembered Empire once they were cut off from the rest of the Imperium of Man and they feared the Emperor killed. He actually made Sanguinius a new Emperor and had the Lion act as the Lord Protector. Now in 40k today, Guilliman is the Lord Commander of the Imperium. Dante is the Lord Commander of Imperial Nihilus. And the Lionel Johnson is basically a Lord Protector again. So should somebody want to create some propaganda against the 13th Primarch, it would be very easy to do so because he's basically made a new Unremembered Empire. So in that respect, I do think, books like Godblight could play into civil war. Interesting how the Emperor's own definition of what is and isn't a god depends on whether the entity in question is worth worshipping. Yeah, I guess as well. I think that one of the explanations, I don't know if the Emperor ever says this, but like the Perpetual Urda, who you'd presume her views are actually aligned with the Emperor on this issue. One of the things she says is that the Chaos Gods aren't really gods because we make them. Or, we didn't create all of them to start with, but our thoughts and emotions empower them. And in that respect, is that a god? Is that what a god is? Something that can be made by mortal beings? Like humanity could make another god if they so wanted to, or after a very long sequence of worshipping certain emotions. There's, in that respect, they're not really gods. And I guess it's, Guilliman does say that he says his father lied because there are gods, and then he says, my father lied there are gods. Or, well, at least there are things that call themselves gods. So Guilliman, I think, is sort of teetering. You know, he is definitely open to the idea that maybe there are such a thing as gods. Or at the very least, the difference is going to be down to definition. So I think that practically it makes sense. Of all of the Primarchs, I think Guilliman will be most accepting. And it will be cool because when you have that inevitable reunion with the Lorgar, it will be bloody hilarious. Hey, so will the return of the Necron Empire result in the Orcs evolving back into Crocs? Cool question. I don't think so. I guess even the Beast from the War in the Beast, I think that there is a massive difference between that and the Krork, because the Krork, from what we know, had all this like incredible technology, and so they don't have that kind of understanding in mind. But I guess it's an unexplored area of the setting already, the idea of evolving back into a Krork, but it's definitely a fun thing to speculate on. So it wouldn't surprise me that's one of the, it wouldn't surprise me to see Ghazghkull want to take on the Silent King, because every time Ghazghkull sort of dies or gets defeated, he kind of comes back a little bit stronger. Do you know what I mean? And so the idea that he might come to the conclusion that facing the Necrons would be a significant boost in his power level, I think that makes sense. Okay, yes, we're getting towards the end now. So I've mentioned Belisarius Cawl multiple times in this stream so far. We've got up next 2 books with Belisarius Cawl in. Belisarius Cawl the Great Work, Belisarius Cawl Genefather. Fascinating character. I've done a video on Alpha Primus, which has done very well. I think people like that character a lot. And he is basically the most powerful Space Marine that there's ever been. He is a being of unimaginable power. And seemingly even the Emperor has an interest in this very unique Space Marine that Belisarius Cawl has created to be his bodyguard. But he made this Space Marine with chimeric gene seed, and potentially, and it's implied to be gene seed of all 20 legions. So he has not just powerful psychic, but all these kind of crazy gifts that were unique to Space Marine chapters. So like he has the invisibility of the Raven Guard, and he has the resistance of the Death Guard, and all this kind of crazy stuff. So Alpha Primus is really interesting development in Belisarius Cawl's character. But the main plotline you need to understand from these 2 books is Cawl's mission to save the Imperium. Cawl is a really fascinating character. He is incredibly arrogant, but one of the reasons he's incredibly arrogant is not just because he's smart, but because he believes his intelligence has been officially what's the word I'm looking for? Okayed. He's been officially ordained. No, what's the word I'm looking for? The Emperor himself has basically blessed Cawl's work. He has given Cawl permission to do whatever Cawl wants to do. And the reason we know that is because Cawl has multiple personalities within himself. One of his abilities is to what we call soul merge, and that means he can combine his mind with other people's, and he has multiple minds attached to him. However, Cawl's personality and ego is so dominant, he always remains the dominant personality, and he just regains their memories and their intelligence. And one of the minds that he sort of like absorbed, as it were, was the mind of a scientist who had worked with the Emperor in creating the Space Marines. And the Emperor left a message in this man's mind for Belisarius Cawl, telling him that Cawl will think he has betrayed the Emperor someday, but he will not in the end. So Cawl has taken that to believe he can do whatever he wants without consulting anyone already. And he has done many things that have annoyed Guilliman and pissed him off. So he's a fascinating character. He created a clone of his mind and gave that to Guilliman so Guilliman could talk to and transfer messages. He created a clone of an alleged approximated clone of Guilliman's mind. He has a trapped Necron that he like consults if he needs help on. He is a completely wild character, but he is 10,000 years old and has made some great contributions to the Imperial war effort. He can heal worlds, like in Belisarius' Call, the Great Work, where he is able to basically heal a world that had been previously devoured by Tyranids. He is able to transfer the Catan that was on the planet sort of across the galaxy, and he's even able to use his technology to interfere with Necron technology. That's how smart he is. So he's really fundamental to that fight. And of course, he healed the Primarch and played a significant role in that and was responsible for improving the Space Marines. So Cool has had a wild story. I would recommend both of these books. They're very good. Guy Haley has written this character very well. In the book Genefather, we see him go up against Fabius Bile, who's another kind of true genius within the setting. And Fabius Bile is very interested in Alpha Primus because he wants the technology that Belisarius Cawl has created, and he doesn't even kill Primus, even though he can, because he thinks he's such a wonderful work of art. If you know from it who Bile is, I've spoken about him on streams, but he's the previous chief of apothecary of the Emperor's Children Legion, back when they were a legion, and he is sort of like a renegade character within the forces of chaos nowadays, and he is trying to create a new type of space marine for Abaddon. But yeah, it's a really good story. Would definitely recommend. And in this book, this is as far as we get with Cawl and Guilliman's plan to save the Imperium of Man, because in this book, Cawl reveals to other members of the Mechanicus who originally want to put him on trial that he thinks they can save the Imperium, close the Great Rift, by utilizing a series of worlds that have these Necron pylons on to essentially re-establish the old Necron network that kept the Great Rift contained. And he understands a lot of the technology, because in the story Fall of Cadia, we see him speak to Trazen the Infinite, who explains some of the basics. But he has done a lot of experiments since then, and he can understand a lot of the technology, but he can't create the network. And that's fundamental. So he could close a very small warp rift, but he needs to close a massive one. And so he needs to create the network. And to do this, he comes up with this plan to find more information. He wants to travel to a Necron world that had previously been destroyed, or is being destroyed, or it's a complicated word. Basically, it was destroyed by a black hole. However, because of the way black holes and gravity work and time works, they think it might be possible to travel to this planet that was destroyed by a black hole during the War in Heaven. It probably had a black hole thrown at it by the old ones, the Necrons or something. And he wants to travel to this world to understand how the pylons work, because it was a central planet when creating the pylon network, and thereafter grab that information and somehow travel back to 40k, and thereby he can save the Imperium. It is a crazy plan, but at some point, Guy Haley's going to write that book. So look forward to that one. I'll tell you that. There we go. And we have 2 books left. So we have The Devastation of Baal by Guy Haley. This is the book that is the second to the end. And as I say, it could arguably be right at the start, in that we do see the Great Rift open in this book. It does take place, part of it, before Guilliman returns. But because there's so many time and warp shenanigans, Guilliman actually arrives at Baal at the end of this book, which is a very emotional scene, and if you've ever read that, you'll know what I mean. But this is the story of the Blood Angels trying to save their world, with all of the chapters, at least the ones that will come to them, that are sons of Sanguinius. They all fall back to Baal and try and make their stand against High Fleet Leviathan, the 4th Tyrannic War. That is... the Third Tyrannic War. So in the Third Tyrannic War, the Tyranids decided to basically try and wipe the Blood Angels off the map. And the Blood Angels fight a very valiant pseudo last stand. Most of them die, and they pretty much all have to get replaced by Primaris Marines. But the main characters survive, and they all get a really good showing. Dante, of course, is the wonderful Golden Warrior that we all know to be. If you're not familiar, Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, it has been said that Sanguinius had a vision of a Golden Warrior who would one day stand and defend the Emperor of Mankind in the final days of the Imperium, and Dante believes that's himself. And Mephiston, the chief librarian of the Blood Angels, he's always a complete monster, and in this book he wipes out, I think, 10,000 Tyranids with one blast. It's completely nuts. He's a completely crazy character. Dante is also like pretty much the oldest living serving Space Marine that's like within a traditional structure of the Space Marines. So he's like probably by this point, I think he's 1500 years old. By modern 40k, he's probably closer to 2000. He's very, very ancient, and he recently got a new body though, so he's back and loving life presumably. But yeah, it's amazing. Crazy things happen in this book. Even the forces of Khorne rock up once the Great Rift opens, and they end up actually fighting against the Tyranids, because the Karbanda, one of the greatest champions of Khorne, he has determined that if anyone's going to wipe out the Blood Angels, it will be him. So in their own weird way, the Blood Angels are aided by the forces of Khorne, which is a ridiculous plot point, but very cool. And then that takes us on to the final book of the series, Lionel Johnson, Son of the Forest. And this is pretty much as far as you get with modern 40k. There are a couple of minor books that sort of go beyond it, but they're not really important to the plot. So like, for example, the Dark Angels did have another book for Lazarus, and Lazarus at the end of that book is recalled to the Rock by the returned lion, and that's the first time the lion reveals his return to his sons officially. However, this book is pretty much the end of the main storylines that we have in 40k. I have discussed this book at quite some length, as have a lot of people. So if you've never read this one, it's definitely high up on the list of reading. It's a 10 out of 10. I would say Devastation of Baal, if I didn't rank that, I would say that's probably a 10 out of 10 too. They're both incredible books. And Lionel Johnson, Son of the Forest, brings the lion back. The lion, if you're not familiar, was a very difficult Primarch in his youth. No one really liked working with him, even though he was very impressive, incredible in lots of ways. But he was also a bit of a dick, and no one really wanted to work with the guy. However, he's now come back. He's all kind of... he's very humble now. He's very willing to accept his mistakes. He's very willing to take criticism. He's far older and he's got new challenges. He gets new weapons. He's got new abilities. It's a really good book. And whereas when he was younger, he was always committed to sort of being the War Master. He always wanted to be the War Master instead of Horus. When Horus falls, he wants to be the new War Master. Now he's sort of gone through this like huge humbling journey after all of his sons have betrayed him, and now he's adamant just to serve humanity, serve the Emperor, and will do that in whatever way he can. It's a really good book, definitely recommend. And at the end of that, he actually does run in to Dante, the chapter master of the Blood Angels, who have heard that there's another Primarch. And it's at the end of the book he discovers that he's not the only Primarch to have returned, because Rabute Guilliman is also back. The 40k storyline does extend beyond this book a bit, because we have the Arcs of Omen series, which came out a couple of years ago, and that series has the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels kind of teaming up together, and they end up doing battle against Vashtor and Abaddon's forces. And it's a pseudo... It's a loss for the Imperium, really, in that it establishes the lion's return. The lion is reunited with his sons, and that's a wonderful moment. But the forces of chaos, Vashtor, he gets his hands on these very powerful engines, one of which had been under the control of the Dark Angels, and he is able to create this very powerful engine, dissonance engine, and he uses the remnants of the Dark Angels' destroyed homeworld of Caliban, known as Wormwood. And that takes us to the end of the timeline. Sorry, we are well over 2 hours in now, so thanks for bearing with me. That was a lot to do from memory. But there we go. That's all right. Let me just check chat. Yes. So yeah, the series is definitely the list of books is definitely really good. Let's just, you know what, I'll just reiterate before I go through chat, like sort of what I think the main plot lines are and the main things you need to know from this series. It's probably not everything, but from this series, I would say you have the failing Golden Throne and the fact that the Emperor is going to die in probably about 100 years from current 40k. When the 40k timeline moves, it moves quite quickly. You, of course, have the return of the Primarchs, and they want to meet each other and find each other and have a big hug, and everyone will get along really well, I'm sure. You do have a couple of threats of civil war. So you have people spreading rumors that Guilliman's trying to create a new empire, and the discovery that Guilliman basically did that once before. And with the death of the Fabricator General of Mars, some of the Martians are now committed to the idea that the Emperor is going to die. And when the Emperor dies, they want to make a play to make a new Martian empire as large as possible. And they are guarding this secret very heavily, to the degree that if you even find out that the Fabricator General has died, they'll kill you. So it's a very closely guarded secret. Then what have we got? Then you've got the Star Child storyline. This idea that the Emperor's soul, half the Emperor's soul, the half not on the Golden Throne, is going to be reborn into a new body. That at some point is going to be a massive storyline in the future. And you've got characters that I think are likely connected to this storyline. You have multiple new Imperial Saints. You even have this new kind of Chaos Saint who's got this Anathane blade, which is not just a weapon that is a sentient weapon that can defeat a Primarch, but it's been empowered even further to now be able to pierce the Aegis of the Emperor. And that probably matters quite a lot, because the Emperor has been, from the warp, the Star Child side of him, it looks like it's been working to save his sons quite a lot, to the degree that in the Silent King book, for example, this Dark Apostle fires these warp arrows at Guilliman, and the Emperor just comes down and swipes these arrows out the air, and they all turn into nothing. So the Emperor is directly intervening in battles to save his sons, which is, I mean, it's crazy. It's just completely crazy. Then, yes, Guilliman and Belisarius Caul's plan to close the Great Rift. That's what they need to happen. I think there's probably quite a few years away now, because we've still not properly expanded the lore into Imperium Nihilus. There's still a lot left to uncover in that side of the setting, but there's still a lot going down. And then, the Necrons and the Parianex is still a huge problem. Hopefully we'll get a new campaign book on that. Maybe not this edition, but next edition, and that'll be very, very big. And then in addition to that, I just promised you the final thing is the Lion does have a bunch of his own little storylines that are hinted at in Mike Brooks's novel. This character called the Fisher King, which is thought to be like a embodiment of the Emperor, that gives, or like is sitting there, and there are these items on the table that are supposedly important to the Lion, and you have a candelabra, a spear, and what's the other one? Candelabra, a spear, and a chalice. So the Lion's got his own stuff going on. Completely insane. There's a lot of big stuff. I'll probably do another stream at some point talking about like big plot lines, because it'll be interesting to talk more about those. But completely crazy. Let me know what you guys think. Are you it's definitely a hell of a time to be into Warhammer 40k, but it's a really weird thing, because the plot, it feels like a lot of the stories are moving really slowly, especially as they tell stories that are back into the timeline. But at the same time, you also have these storylines that are massive and galaxy shaking going on. So it's, they can only move forward with so many of them at once, do you know what I mean? But hey ho. So that takes us up to the very kind of recent Warhammer 40k timeline. That's sort of, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be the end of the Indomitus Crusade, because in a way it's always going to be ongoing. Guilliman's always going to be trying to bring more worlds back into the Imperial fold. The Imperial Nihilus won't be brought in for a long time. But I think that's the bulk of the Indomitus focused lore that we're going to get for a while. And I'm very excited to see what comes next. There are a bunch of big plot lines going forward. And even though 40k has moved very slow at times, there's a lot going on. And I guess when you look at it in this sense, it sort of makes sense why they move slow, because there's too many big plot lines to push forward all at once. But let me know what you think. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you think of them. There are genuinely some fantastic books here. There's some that are fine, and then there's some that contain Space Wolves. But overall, I think you've got such a good timeline there for us all to work off, and I would definitely recommend most of those books to people, which is quite a nice thing to say, because it's 40k has a lot of books that aren't so great, but it's nice that a lot of the main ones now you can truly recommend to people based on the fact that they're really enjoyable. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please let me know what you're most excited for, which books you enjoyed the most, and what you want to hear more about. And I will see you guys next time. Take care.